As promised from our last philosophy video, we will here explore the application of the ancient philosophy known as Epicureanism into our day-to-day lives. So I should say that, speaking from personal experience, I do see this as useful, for while I do not hold to any particular life philosophy, nonetheless, if I was pressed on the matter, I would most likely give some sort of answer in the form of pursuing my desires and interests as a tentative meaning of life, which I suppose is very much in line with some Epicurean hedonism in many aspects. In addition, I find that I often stress elements such as the importance of having a routine, as well as viewing the small things in life as often being the most important to me. So then, as these concepts align well with Epicureanism, it might not be a totally bad idea to at the very least give these ideas a go in terms of a thoughtful examination. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's explore in more detail what ideas we're talking about here to get a motivation for the philosophy at hand. I'll quickly mention here that I do have other videos on Epicurus if you find the ideas presented here at all interesting, and if you want to give a further dive into the ideas. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive into the philosophy of Epicurus. One may state that at the core of Epicurus and his philosophy lies a prescription along hedonistic lines of following one's desires for the attainment of pleasure, which rather importantly he defined as, among others, as the absence of pain. I stress the word here importantly because one could easily imagine a scenario where one derived a great deal of pleasure from some illicit drug, let's say heroin, but it would nonetheless be the case that there here would lie an amplitude of pain as the addiction phase sets in, not to talk about the related emotional pain, which also frequents the habit in question. This is all to point out that we should not be trapped in the misinformed stereotype of Epicureanism, as it is often presented in terms of overindulgence, excessive hedonism, and a general lack of concern for those around you. Therefore, what is meant in an Epicurean sense when referring to hedonism is not a type of excessive hedonism, but rather seeking out pleasures which have an inherent value in themselves and are not for attaining other things such as egoistic overindulgence. One might also introduce here the Greek word of ataraxia, which Epicurus took to be in symmetry with pleasure, which can be translated as imperturbability. This is also an important concept for the competing school of Stoicism, which we will not go into great detail here in this video. Anyways, ataraxia was for Epicurus to be taken as an ultimate end, as the cultivation of this state would translate to a peace of mind, as well as to, quote, the dispelling of irrational fears that are born of ignorance and superstition. Furthermore, pleasure was for Epicurus divided into two separate categories. Number one, the static pleasure defined in terms of freedom from pain and disturbance avoidance, and number two, the dynamic pleasure tied with feeling pleasure in terms of an increase in happiness. The first type of pleasure was for Epicurus to be seen as a higher form of pleasure, as it involved the formation of a pleasant mind coupled with pleasant moods, which was independent of the external conditions one finds oneself in. This in turn means that one may even be in a condition of suffering, such as, for example, experiencing kidney pain in the hospital, and yet be able to cultivate a form of static pleasure. According to Epicurus, there was much wisdom to be garnished from a person's ability to engage with this type of static pleasure, and it obviously follows directly from this that one could cultivate wisdom in the same type of manner. We find a justification for the primacy and existence of this first form of pleasure in the writings of the Roman statesman of Cicero, where to quote, "As soon as every animal is born, it seeks after pleasure and rejoices in it as the greatest good, while it rejects pain as the greatest bad, as far as possible, and avoids it. And it does this when it is not yet corrupted on the innocent and sound judgment of nature itself." We see therefore from the preceding quote the appeal to an uncorrupted infant state of human beings, where what is pursued instinctively is that of pure pleasure-seeking, which can be taken as being very much in line with the emphasis of Epicurean philosophy. The second form of pleasure takes a more dynamic approach and refers to the type of pleasure that we experience when performing or participating in an activity. One could imagine, for example, a person finding a great deal of pleasure in a game of ping pong, where the act of playing ping pong was weighted as a regular regiment to the person's life. This type of pleasure is then associated in essence with obtaining a form of pleasure associated with an activity, and thus is a pleasure which we want or actively seek out. This can in turn be contrasted to the static pleasure previously discussed, which is in turn independent of external events and can be obtained even when we don't get what we want. I should note here that there is some empirical merit to the superiority of this type of static pleasure, where we may cite Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert, who relabels static pleasures with that of synthetic pleasures, which he defines as a pleasure which is in no need of assistance from externals. He further argues that this type of pleasure is superior to dynamic pleasures, as it can be seen as a reflection of a liberated being from the sense of independence which is garnished in this type of pleasure. This pleasure is taken to be associated with a being who is not necessarily dependent upon positive outcomes of events and activities in order to maintain a high degree of pleasure, which I suspect for a great many people seems desirable. As an addition, we can relate pleasure-seeking with that of acting according to sensations, where one could argue that all decisions we make are really dependent upon considering how these decisions will make us feel either in the present or in the future. Thus, to act towards pleasure is to act within one's own self-interest in terms of positive sensations, which Epicurus concluded that all humans strive after naturally. There is therefore a naturalistic component, or an appeal, if you will, to human nature in the philosophy of Epicurus as well. This seems pretty intuitive to me, as humans are social animals, but one should also note that we still do not know much substantive in terms of human nature, so we often find ourselves in unexplored territory. The argument for pleasure given by Epicurus is nonetheless appealing, as it is not difficult to account for actions that we have performed in the past, say riding a bike or playing a video game, where there will be some positive and negative association with these types of activities. Therefore, when picking an action or making a choice, one can simply ask oneself if one will get some pleasure or positive sensation from performing these actions, which will then cultivate a dynamic pleasure. Seems like a pretty straightforward argument, unless of course one wants to argue against the importance of the experience of sensation. But I think for most people, Epicurus's argument seems rather intuitively appealing. If we were to look at a counter-argument, however, we could argue here that, hey, it's not the initial pleasure of performing an action that should matter to us, but rather the strife and toil upon initiating an activity which is against our desires that we should place emphasis upon here. An activity which nonetheless affords us a sense of achievement, perhaps in line with some sense of virtue, after having performed it, where the initial work itself was devoid of pleasure. Keeping in line with the Stoic tradition, one would here then not place emphasis on pleasure itself, but rather consistently making correct decisions in accordance with some defined virtue. We end this overview with regards to pleasure by mentioning the three forms of goods pertaining to pleasure as given by Epicurus. These goods are understood in terms of necessary conditions for pursuing pleasure and are given as follows. Number 1, the analyzed life. Number 2, friendship. And lastly, number 3, autarky or individual self-governance. The first of these keeps much in line with the famous quote from Socrates, where he claimed that the unexamined life was not worth living. If we furthermore relate the notion of an unexamined life to Epicurus's insistence upon pleasure, we may in this case emphasize the potential for an amplitude of unnecessary suffering which may arise as a consequence of conformity to established norms, ignorance in general, or lastly, the holding of irrational fears which all bring about suffering. It therefore follows, according to Epicurean philosophy, that we should emphasize an examined life, which should be done on a day-to-day basis. Anything from observing our moods to the analysis of effects which new impressions generates, as well as the observation of one's overall habits, are all important components of the examined life, which easily could be brought over to our modern existence. The cultivation of friendship was, as I have previously touched upon on other videos on Epicurus's philosophy, very much important for Epicurus in terms of striving for a pleasurable life, and in fact was so important that it was placed as a fundamental component of a happy and fulfilled life. The justification for friendship being tied with a necessary fulfilled life may be seen along the strong potential of friendship in terms of providing support, companionship, an instilled sense of virtue, and lastly comprising a grounded component which makes life tied with a sense of belonging. The last form of good mentioned here for the cultivation of pleasure is that of autarky, which we may translate as self-sufficiency. This may perhaps be seen as a bit strange, as I just mentioned here the strong importance of friendship, which we immediately now follow up with the weighting of a strong sense of independence. Surely, Epicurus does not mean in this context the isolation and independence for others, but rather he can be taken to talk about the importance of developing an inner contentment and tranquility, which sounds a lot like the static form of pleasure we talked about earlier, doesn't it? By being independent, one can more easily focus on the simple pleasures of life instead of being tied in a relationship of dependence. Thus, we can here cultivate Epicurean virtues and motivate our reasoning to not be dependent upon far-fetched external desires. We may further discuss these simple desires in coming in the form of basic needs, such as food, shelter, as well as friendship, which we just mentioned. Much of the goal then of following Epicurean prescriptions would be in cultivating a mindset conditioned upon simple pleasures which are freed from external desires such as societal pressures. Certainly a valuable lesson to take away from Epicurus and his philosophy. We mention here that the importance of pleasure may be seen as having found a following in the life of Epicurus himself, who lived a very ascetic life, yet a pleasurable life according to sources. Even when meeting disease in the very end times of his life, it is reported that he met this struggle with great dignity, claiming pain only to be temporal in nature. Perhaps thinking about pain coming in terms of waves made it easier for him somehow to cultivate his sense of static pleasure. Who knows? In any case, we may extend suffering into death, which, stemming from the fact that Epicureans were seen as materialists, would not invoke the religious connotations of an afterlife. Lucretius, for instance, argues in favor of death being compared to that of sleep, where he relates that just as one does not fear sleep, one should not fear death itself. To quote, "Nobody misses himself or the life he leads when both his mind and body have fallen asleep. For all we care that sleep might be everlasting, there is no trace of any regret for ourselves, and yet in sleep the elements have not left us or wandered away from contact with the senses, and when the man awakes, he collects himself. Death must therefore concern us less than sleep, if anything can be less than nothing is. Much greater confusion in the material elements follow at death, and nobody wakes again when once the chilling interval has occurred." This remarks the naturalization of death and the insistence upon relating it to natural processes which we all must engage with at some juncture in time, even though sleep might seem more acceptable to us as we engage with it so frequently, there is nothing stopping us from cultivating a strong contemplation of the reality of death itself and try to furthermore to seek out greater expansions of pleasures derived from our day-to-day lives. Therefore, we might conclude here that developing ataraxia and other Epicurean virtues will better prepare us for life, as well as making the notion of death more accommodating. That is, if one does not face death before having developed these faculties, in which case death could be interpreted as unwelcome under Epicurean philosophy. Getting back to Epicurus, his sense of pleasure even extended to his place of learning during his lifetime, which was known as Hokipos, the Epicurean Garden. Here, there was no diploma or other graduation formalities, but rather an insistence upon a subculture dedicated to the simple pleasures of life, as well as the examination of one's own life in pleasant environments. One may also comment upon here, as the lack of formality may have been a reflection of a sort of anti-elitism, where while attending the garden, one should not emphasize one's own authority and place within society. According to secondary sources, this also reflected the treatment of slaves by Epicurus himself, which, if we believe the sources, would have been very affable for the time period, where the treatment of slaves varied greatly in society. The cultivation of one's own life in terms of desires and happiness, and an academic place of learning, was a shared emphasis among many ancient Greek philosophers, such as Plato, where it would for them seem rather odd if somehow teleported into our own civilization were they learning about philosophy, happiness, and ethics from our society's educational system is not weighted generally in any significant degree. In addition, the enterprise of teaching and learning about happiness, as well as the meaning of life from a philosophical context, has long been replaced within the confines of philosophy, where the discipline has instead evolved in the lines of the clarification of concepts, the analysis of language, as well as a placed emphasis to develop logical arguments for the development of tackling philosophical problems. However, from the point of view of Epicurus, there would be aspects of modern philosophy to cherish, even within this form of goal setting, as knowledge, according to Epicurus, was a wholesome component in achieving a fulfilled as well as virtuous life, where in opposition to Pyrrho and the skeptics, knowledge reflected something that was both obtainable as well as desirable. He further challenged the skeptics by making a claim to the credence of empirical observations, which at times technically could be faulty, but nonetheless constituted a reliable source of information. He even made a claim about skeptics undermining ataraxia by their espousal of cultivating uncertainness, which could easily be coupled with a sense of angst and dread, thus increasing suffering. Lastly, he emphasized critical thinking skills and the challenge of dogma, which were again traits that one could find for large portions of ancient Greek history. Having discussed some key components of Epicurean philosophy for the cultivation of a pleasant life, we will end this video here with discussing more practical approaches to this philosophy in the attempt to make it a little less abstract and more applicable to our everyday lives. This might also be viewed in conjunction with self-help, as a sort of philosophical approach to self-help, if you will. We may begin by making a comment upon cultivating simple practices where we remember that the goal is to avoid an excessive form of hedonism, or dare we say mindless hedonism. It is therefore important that we learn to discipline our desires. For Epicurus, then, one should not overindulge in food, wine, and even in sex one should opt for moderation, as too much indulgence will dull the senses to the intrinsic nature of pleasure. The positive aspect here in regards to Epicurean philosophy is that we need very little material needs in order to feel fulfilled in our lives. Many of the desires which we often find ourselves in want of are rather seen as cravings, where it is not the fact that these cravings are always intrinsically bad in their own sake, but rather we should not depend upon these cravings for happiness, as we can be perfectly content without them. Turning it back to giving practical advice, we should here seek to be in possession of both a mental as well as physical independence, where we do not fall into the trap of mindless spending on external cravings, which we can be satisfied without. What is to be avoided here then is a state of psychological slavery in terms of momentary external cravings. Rather, according to Epicurus, seek the simple life along with pleasures. Towards the goal of cultivation of a pleasant mind, a practical advice here would be to keep a journal where one may make reference to what exactly was in correspondence with a particularly pleasant mood or pleasant mind. It may also help in examining one's own life, which was one of the three goods towards pleasure, where a journal may help to give special attention to one's ignorance and conformity to established beliefs around oneself. It may help here to borrow inspiration from Buddhism as well, where there is an insistence upon mindfulness being tied with a component of the Eightfold Path. Here, one is encouraged to pay deep attention to one's own thought patterns and emotions while keeping a focus on the present. I do not see any reason as to meditation not being compatible with Epicureanism, so it may also be something to explore here. Cultivating practices towards exercise may be seen as beneficial, as it can accommodate being tied to a dynamic pleasure, where the release of endorphins will generate dynamic pleasures, as well as perhaps hindering more pain down the road in terms of suffering as one cultivates a state of being in better shape. One could cite Epicurus's prescription to pain being only temporary, and there may be ways to better cope with pain tolerance, such as through dietary means. I know that there is some evidence for the eating of hot peppers, for instance, in order to better cope with pain tolerance, but I am not sure how reliable it is. There are also food which are studied in relation to the alleviation of headaches. The main message here is to cultivate well-being, as it will lead to more pleasure and less suffering following Epicurean principles. A surrounding of friends is seen as a central aspect of Epicurean philosophy, where if one is lacking in this department, one might try to engage with hobbies in the hope of meeting other people, such as learning a martial art or going to gym classes. One should also here develop a sense of independence and virtuous qualities, such as trust and loyalty, in the hope that one may be better in finding these qualities in other people. These qualities will include trust, mutual respect, as well as shared virtuous values. Lastly, seek knowledge and follow through with intellectual pursuits, while having knowledge as an end goal in itself, rather than for external reasons pertaining to practicality. Expanding your knowledge of the world will hopefully foster less ignorance in your own thought patterns and habits. So that ends our video on Epicurus and his applicability to day-to-day life. And well, as this is the 5th video in the series on Epicurus, I will probably do another philosophical topic for the next couple of philosophy videos. If you have any comments to what topic that should be, you could also feel free to leave them in the comments. It also helps if you like and subscribe the video. But until next time, thank you.